Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Zzeem podcast, On Time and On Track, Proven Strategies for Effective Meetings. Before I hand it off to my colleagues Asif and Erin, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. As we are located in Toronto, we acknowledge that the land we are on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Just a few housekeeping items to mention before we get started with today's webinar. All attendees are on mute. If you have a question for Erin, Asif, or myself, please send it through the chat section of your Zoom window. All questions regarding the presentation content will be held until the end of the presentation when we open for Q&A. During the Q&A period, we please ask that you use the Raise Hand feature. This feature is found on your dashboard and is the fourth icon from the right. Now, without further delay, I'd like to now introduce you to my colleague Asif, who will be providing some context on today's topic of meeting management. Asif?
Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the HPO podcast. I'm Asif Ahmed. I am an executive director with Zzeem, and today I'll be interviewing Erin Roberts, who is one of the partners at Zzeem. For those who are joining us today for the first time, Zzeem is a consulting and an association management agency, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. Today, we are going to be talking about effective meeting management for your association, whether it be your board, committee, or the AGMs. This podcast is part of the High Performance Membership Organization series, otherwise known as the HPO podcast. As many of you know, we at Zzeem had coined these terms some years ago, and we shared with you an HPO assessment tool for you to provide a way for the associations to measure their level of excellence. If you'd like to find out more about HPO, please let us know and we'll share with you some links. Without further delay, I'd now like to invite Erin to the show. Hi, Erin.
Hi, Asif. It's a pleasure to be here. And for those of you who know Asif and I, you know we're both executive directors. So the information we're sharing with you is what we've learned through hands-on experience. For those of you who are regular attendees at our events, you know we deliver practical, valuable information that you can use immediately. These events also give us an opportunity to help you see some of the work that we do. So when you're looking for help, you'll reach out to us.
Excellent. Erin, we've got a great topic lined up today, and I'm sure that's going to resonate with a lot of our attendees today. So without getting into further or off topic, I would say let's get into the topic. And my first question would be, what is the most important thing that you can do to ensure an effective and productive meeting?
Thanks very much, Asif. You know, the most important thing you can do is preparation. And this is something that we often forget. You know, we organize the meeting, maybe we put an agenda together, we call everybody together, and then we just kind of let it evolve. That's not really what we want to do if we want to make sure we have effective meetings. So start off with, what is the required deliverable for the meeting? What is the most important thing we need to get done? Make sure you've got that clear in your mind if you're going to be managing and getting the meeting organized. And then once you figured out what those deliverables are, why do those deliverables matter and where do they fit into the bigger picture? Because remember, you are going to be selling this meeting to the participants. They need to understand what the purpose is, why we are going to be taking up their valuable time. So make sure you know what the deliverables are, where do they fit into the bigger picture. Keep it simple. Don't try to get too many things done with one meeting. Decide whether more than one meeting is going to be required. 2 short meetings are going to be more tolerable than one long meeting. So keep that in mind. Deliverables and how do they fit into the bigger picture. Second thing, pay attention to your attendees. Don't have too many people at the meeting. Minimize the number of people that need to be there. Only have the people that can actually contribute to the outcome. You can also always bring in people later when you know what the outcome is going to be, but don't have too many people in the meeting or it's going to be very easy to get off track. And this is absolutely critical. prepare a draft agenda ahead of time. Now, you're going to walk into your meeting with a detailed agenda for sure, but remember, you've got to sell the meeting. So prepare a draft agenda ahead of time, show it to the people that you want to be at the meeting, get their buy-in and get their feedback. So basically, you're selling the meeting to them and you're answering that question, what's in it for me? Why should I bother showing up to this meeting? Then finally, prepare a detailed agenda. Now, when I say a detailed agenda, I'm talking about whether it's a committee meeting or an AGM, it's the same thing. You want all of your agenda items on there, and you want timing for each agenda item, because the facilitator needs to know how long you want for each agenda item and how much time it's worth spending on it. So make sure you've got a detailed agenda. So preparation is the most important thing. If you're well prepared, you can probably manage almost everything else.
Right. That's I guess the key takeaway is that you have to be prepared in advance for a meeting. Now, it's interesting that you talk about facilitators. So what should a facilitator need to know for the meeting?
Good point. And maybe let's just circle back to preparation again. Make sure you have someone to facilitate the meeting. And preferably somebody who's got some experience in meeting facilitation, because the facilitator really makes all the difference to keeping the meeting on track. So whoever that facilitator is going to be, whether it's you or somebody else, the things the facilitator needs to know is, first of all, make sure that the facilitator understands the concept of how to keep the meeting on schedule, that the facilitator understands that their deliverable is to keep the meeting on track and to make sure that all the agenda items are delivered. You want to make sure that the facilitator, unless they're a very seasoned facilitator, make sure that they've got some tips for how to keep participants engaged and focused. So that they've got some thoughts for what happens if there's silence, what happens if one person is dominating. Be aware of individuals who might take the meeting off track. If the meeting that you're having has potential controversy around it, or you've got somebody who's got an axe to grind, you can probably predict that in advance. So think about who the disruptors might be, what the sources of potential conflict or disagreement might be. Make sure that the facilitator is prepared for that and is able to handle it. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But again, preparation for the disruptors as well is part of your preparatory work. Also, have a plan B available for possible outcomes. Make sure that the facilitator has a plan B. It might be that the most important thing that we've got to get done at this meeting gets derailed right from the start because we all just realized, wait a minute, what about this? So make sure that the facilitator has a plan B. If we have to be taken off track because we realize there's something we should have done, what is the plan B and how will that change the deliverables for the meeting? So those are the things that I would say you want to make sure the facilitator knows ahead of time.
Excellent. Now, you and I have had the opportunity of facilitating a lot of meetings. My question to you would be, what about the facilitator is an external facilitator and they don't know about your attendees? How would you go about orienting them about the people that are at the meeting and any red flags, perhaps?
Okay, really good point. Now, I've been an external facilitator in a lot of situations, especially for things like strategic planning, or we've got to hash through something. So I'll walk in there to a board that I have not worked with before, and maybe I've been engaged by the CEO. I always ask that question. I always say, okay, what is the potential controversy that could come up here? Who are the people that tend to dominate the conversation? Do they have any access to grind? So as a facilitator, I'm always asking those questions ahead of time. So if you've got a third-party facilitator coming in, hopefully they'll be asking you those questions anyways. But if you're the CEO, make sure that you brief them before they get started.
Good idea. How do you deal with conflict or disagreement at a meeting?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, anytime there's disagreement or conflict or people that are dominating the conversation or trying to take things off track, that is one of the most important roles you have as a facilitator. When people are taking the meeting off track, one thing that I find works really surprisingly well is nobody wants the meeting to go over time. Nobody. So if you come back to them and say, I think that's a great topic and something we should discuss and it's important, but if you want me to get you out of here at 3:30, my job as the facilitator is to get through this agenda and get you out of here on time. So is it okay if we take that topic and move it to another meeting, or maybe we handle it by email so that we're not ending up in a situation where people feel slighted or that they're not being recognized, but we're also saying we can choose between just talking about this and not getting the meeting done or going over time. I find that tends to work really well. In terms of behavior, I think it's important to set expectations at the beginning of the meeting. You might have a group of people that are all really type A and gung-ho, and then the expectations might be, we want to hear from everybody. So once we've heard from you, please step back and give everybody else an opportunity to speak, and the facilitator will be doing that. So set the expectations at the beginning. If you've got a lot of very quiet people, make sure they understand you're expecting them to contribute. They're not just there as bystanders. When the meeting looks like it's diving off into another corner, go back to what I just said earlier. Okay, that's a great point. Thank you very much, Asif. However, I need to get you out of here at 3:30, and I don't think we've got time to do both. So can we move that to another meeting at some point in the future? If you've got a very dominant participant, somebody who talks a lot and they're not trying to, stop other people from talking, but that is in fact what's happening, then you can just say to that person, hi there, Kevin, that's great. And thank you so much. You always give such great ideas at the meeting. Now, I think it's really important that we hear from Bob and Maria and Alan. Bob, Maria, and Alan, what do you have to say? So thank the person for their contribution. Let them know you need to hear from everybody else. And if it gets really heated and people are starting to get personal and misbehaving, in other words, going beyond what you said or the expectations for the meeting, worst case scenario, call for a timeout. Sometimes what you need is to just stand up, get out of the room, everyone take a bio break, grab a cup of coffee. Sometimes a 10-minute break is exactly what you need. But just make sure that the conversation doesn't continue in the corridor. People get more heated when they come back in.
Yeah, that's critical, because you don't want to have a continuation of that conversation when you're back from the bio break.
Exactly. And now, you've come to blows in the hallway. No, that's not what we're looking for.
Okay, so let's talk about how to handle different types of meetings. Is the process different for an AGM versus a board or a committee meeting?
Yeah, good point. Let's start with committee meetings. Committee meetings are kind of a wild card because in some cases, committees can be very formal, almost as formal as an AGM. In some cases, it's a working group of members and it's relatively informal. So generally speaking, committee meetings are less formal, but not necessarily. So it's really a question of how it works within your association. But regardless, committee meeting, formal or informal, you want a clear, timed agenda, and you want the meeting notes from the last meeting. So whenever the committee meets, you want them to be able to see what were the meeting notes from the last meeting, what were the tasks that we assigned and to whom. And again, like any committee meeting or board meeting, start the beginning of the meeting with, okay, here's the action steps we came up with last time. What's the status? Where are they with those action steps? Make sure that even for committee meetings, you've got the relevant briefing materials in the package. Let's face it, you give people briefing materials, they don't necessarily walk into the meeting having read the briefing materials, but at least they're in front of them. And if they haven't had a chance to brief themselves, at least it's there and they can be looking at it while they're thinking of what their response is. Not ideal, but briefing materials are absolutely critical. Make sure that for every committee, in the briefing materials are the mandate and scope of the committee, because it's very easy to get off track. If you're there to talk about membership and you start talking about finance, it means the facilitator can say, thanks very much, Asif, but let's go back. Remember, the mandate for this meeting, for this committee, is membership. And our task is to retain membership at 98% and gain new members at the rate of 10% a year. So make sure you got that mandate at the committee meeting. So that's committee meetings, and they could be more formal. It just depends. Now, for a board meeting, you want to make sure that you're following a process. It might not be as formal as the AGM, or it might be. So, for example, if you're following Robert's rules, and I don't mean, motion, vote, Robert, I'm talking about the whole Robert's rules routine where you can't speak unless you've been recognized by the chair, all that kind of stuff. That is very formal. And if the facilitator is facilitating a Robert's rules meeting, the facilitator needs to know Robert's rules perfectly so that they can manage it. So with a board meeting, like the committee meetings, you want a clear timed agenda and you want the minutes from the previous board meeting. And like the committee meeting, before you get started, you want to review what the tasks were from the last meeting and ask everyone who had a task to comment on where they are. Again, make sure that you've got briefing materials for every agenda item that requires a decision. Now, remember, usually with committees, they are not there to make decisions. They are there to be the arms of the organization and to come back with recommendations and do legwork. At the board meeting, they're expected to make decisions. They're expected to vote. So make sure that every time they have to make a decision or vote, there's always briefing materials in there. So they're making informed decisions. And also, what I find is helpful, usually at a board meeting, the president, the chair, the head of the volunteer board is usually facilitating the meeting, not the CEO or the executive director. But if you are the CEO or the executive director, you can have little cues that you use to help the chair keep on track. So if you find the chair is getting diverted off down, a rabbit hole, it could be just a phrase that you use on a regular basis. Asif, I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. We're going to be heading to break in about 5 minutes, and we still have to get through this agenda item. That helps the chair to get back on track. So that's a tip with respect to board meetings.
Interesting, yes.
Now let's talk about AGMs. AGMs are usually the most formal. And I personally find it's well worth your time to spend a lot of preparation time for the AGM. So don't start doing things a couple of days in advance. Make sure that you've got, just like you would for an event, make sure you've got a timeline for when everything needs to be out the door and needs to be done. I like to have a script for everyone. Everyone who is a speaker or a facilitator at the AGM, make sure that you've got a whole script and it's all mapped out. Because with an AGM, you don't want somebody to kind of make up their own idea about what the vote should be. You want them to be able to read from a script and know exactly what needs to be done, because it's important that you follow processes for the AGM. So make sure that you've got a script for everyone. Now, in terms of the information you're giving to the members, ensure you provide the appropriate amount of information. So, for example, with the financials, you want to make sure that people have everything they need to know. What have we got left in the bank? Are we running a surplus? Or are we running a deficit? How do we expect things to shape out over the course of the next year? So make sure you're providing them with enough information, but don't give them too much information. If they want more information, give them the opportunity to ask it in questions, and be prepared for those questions. But if you don't get the questions, then don't go into more detail. Members will ask for detail when they need it and they feel it's important, but don't feel that you've got to, spend 10 minutes going into a lot of detail that maybe nobody's interested in finding out. Also, make sure that everyone who has a speaking role not only has a script, but they are well briefed. If you're the treasurer and, we had to run a meaningful deficit last year and we had to dip into our surplus, it's important that the treasurer be able to answer questions around that. They may not get asked the questions, but you want to make sure that they've got, basically not a script, but answers for any questions that they might have. Asif, I want to ask you, because I know that, a number of years ago, you were in a challenging situation at an AGM, and, tell me about that and what happened.
Wow, that's a blast from the past. Well, at one of our AGMs, Erin, we had a surprise motion from the floor, which was totally unexpected and problematic. Since we weren't prepared, the motion was voted on and carried.
And then you were left with the aftermath. So
exactly.
How are you going to deal with it?
Exactly.
So did that change how you prepared for the next AGM?
That was actually a turning point for our association, because we amended the bylaws since then, making it more flexible. And we steered away from having motions put on the floor, but the general idea was the discussion would still be going on, but not any motions from the floor per se, because as you know, Erin, the board needs time to process that information and to make sure that they're making the right decision and informed decision. They need to be having that information in advance. So that's what we sort of veered towards.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Preparation aside, if you have somebody from the floor put up their hand and make a motion, basically, if you allow that to go to a vote and people don't have any briefing information, it means the members are making an uninformed vote. You don't want that to happen. So if a motion comes from the floor and the members have all the briefing information they need, then maybe that's not a big deal. But if a motion comes from the floor, what I've observed is, and maybe it's just Canadians that do this, I'm not sure. But when a motion comes from the floor and, somebody who everyone respects say, I have a motion that we should all wear red shoes at the next AGM, people tend to vote yes, because they don't want to disagree. And they don't want to look silly by not knowing what the right answer is. So if you end up in a situation where there's a motion from the floor that members don't have the information to vote on and they're not prepared for, the right thing to do in that situation is say, okay, motion noted. Members are going to need the opportunity to be informed. So the board's going to take that away. The board will do the research, provide the members with the necessary information that they need to vote on this and make a recommendation. So you always have ways of managing things. Just make sure that you've got those answers ready. And generally speaking, having a good answer and one that isn't shutting members down, but is telling them we're hearing you, but let's make sure members know what they're doing before they make a vote.
Excellent. We talked quite a bit about what to do before and during meetings. What about after the meeting?
Okay, that's a good point. Let's say that we are now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the meeting. The facilitator has done a great job, has got us through all of the deliverables on time. Everything's great. I think it's important to give a minute or two to go around the table and ask people for their feedback on the meeting. Because sometimes as a facilitator, you might think, hey, everything went brilliantly. Everyone's in agreement. We know what we want. And it really was, someone is not in agreement at all. And as soon as you leave that table and send out the email, this is what we agreed, somebody's going to come back and go, no, we didn't, or I don't agree with that. So take the opportunity to go around the table. Okay, how do you feel about summarize as a facilitator? This is what I believe we've agreed to. This is who's going to do what. How do you guys feel? Do you guys agree? And how do you feel about the meeting? Go around the table. If you see somebody who's clearly not comfortable, now that's a follow-up that you as the facilitator or the meeting manager are going to need to do, because you want to make sure that you've got everything that you should have had from them, that maybe they didn't contribute enough during the meeting. So ask people how it went. And then if you think there's more that you have to do after the meeting with that person or those people, do that follow-up. That's important. Also make sure that you discuss the follow-up task. So in that summary, here's the things that we all agreed to do and by when. Is that okay with everybody? Is anyone going to have a problem meeting that criteria? And then make sure that after the meeting ends, you have a mechanism for following up on those tasks.
Right.
So if it's somebody's job to do something by, May 15th, how many times are you going to remind them? How are you going to make sure that they take responsibility for that and that things are out to everybody else in a timely manner?
Right.
So follow-up is critical.
Excellent. Now, that leads me to my next question pertaining to your comment on follow-up. What would you say is the best way of getting feedback on the implementation of the action items? Is it via an email ahead of the meeting, or should we have that discussion at the meeting?
I think you mean the status, right? Is it done? Yes, absolutely. I definitely, absolutely suggest that you give people a heads up in advance of the meeting. If it's something that, everybody has a 5-minute task to do, then maybe a couple of days ahead of the meeting is fine. But if it was, I need your feedback on this 30-page document, give them a week ahead, because maybe they put it on their calendar, maybe they didn't, but give them plenty of time to do the job in advance of the meeting. So yes, reminders are important. It doesn't have to be you as the meeting facilitator, but somebody needs to do it.
Somebody needs to prod that person.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Now, this might sound like a weird question to you, but I'm dying to ask you this question. What are some of the mistakes you've made and what did you learn?
Well, Asif, like you, I've learned to be hyper prepared for AGMs. When I first started in this sector, I didn't use a script for the AGM, and it is a beautiful thing having a script. It not only helps, well, I'll give you an example. I mean, even with a script, it doesn't always work out the way you expect it to. I remember one president we had the script right in front of him, and somehow he got 3 pages stuck together and went from the beginning to the end in about 30 seconds. So maybe you can't do anything about that. But being prepared for the AGM, having a script, making sure that you've thought in advance what those difficult questions are going to be. And I will add, with a script, it makes note-taking from the AGM totally easy, because you know exactly what was said, and all you need to do is scribble in the margins, you know, who put the motion, who seconded it, whether or not it was carried, all that kind of stuff. So having the script, having that preparation, those are things that I didn't know at the beginning of my career in this sector. And like you, I learned the hard way. Another thing that I've learned is you can't be too Canadian and still be a good facilitator. So sometimes what happens is you've got a room full of people, all of whom are well-meaning. You like them. There's nothing that they're saying that is irrelevant. But you feel that you've got to give them the floor as long as they want to keep on talking. And you keep thinking, well, surely Asif's going to draw breath in the next couple of minutes. And no, Asif doesn't draw breath. He just keeps going on. So what I felt early in my career as a facilitator, you know, I'm being rude by interrupting Asif. No, you've got to have some nice ways of handling it. Maybe a hand up, something along those lines. Asif, if I could just interject for a minute. If you let anyone dominate the conversation, you are being unfair to the rest of the people in the meeting, and also not being respectful of their time. Because chances are when somebody is taking too long to talk about something, they probably already said what they were going to say in the first 30 seconds, and now they're just kind of they're just kind of listening to their own voice. Rude disruptors. I remember dealing with probably the worst disruptor I'd ever met in my life. And he showed up at a strategic planning meeting, not just with the intent of disrupting, but he brought props.
Oh, no.
He had a little bag of things that he would pull them up and completely divert the conversation. So, you know, if you are a facilitator and you're thinking, well, you know, this guy obviously wants to talk and, you know, it would be rude for me to interrupt him, you would never get a strategic plan done. So things I've learned are no matter who the person is, whether they're a nice person, whether they're a rude person, get control of it right at the beginning, because if they start to build a head of steam, sometimes it can be very difficult to get the meeting back on track. So those are just a few things I've learned, but there are many other mistakes I've made.
Yeah, for sure. We both have our share of experience within, you know, how people treat you at meetings. So yeah, it's a different conversation. So now what I would like to do is to kind of recap our conversation today. So you gave us tips and ideas in these areas. So first is preparation. We discussed how important it is to plan for a great meeting in advance. We talked about focusing on the meeting deliverables, having a great agenda, and choosing the meeting participants carefully. Second, we also discussed what the meeting facilitator needs to know, how to keep the meeting on track, and keep the participants engaged and focused. Third, speaking about participants, we gave you some tips for dealing with conflicts and disruption in meetings.
That's right, Asif. And we shared some tips for different types of meetings, you know, whether it's an AGM, a board meeting, or a committee meeting, how you handle it will be somewhat different for each. We talked about what to do before the meeting, during the meeting, tips for the facilitator, and after the meeting. Even if the meeting itself goes brilliantly, follow-up is critical. It's so important to have good meeting notes and a follow-up plan to make sure that tasks are actually completed.
Excellent. Well, now we have a few questions from our listeners. For that, over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Asif. So our first question is, how can an association staffed by only an executive director and no one else ensure that committees remain active and motivated contributors to association work without having to rely too heavily on the executive director?
That's a really good question, Kevin, because there's a lot of small organizations that just have one staffer, and there's no way that you can get an awful lot done if that one staffer is doing everything. So how do you keep your committees doing their job? Well, first of all, we were talking earlier when we were talking about committee meetings, make sure that at every committee meeting, the agenda includes the mandate of that committee. So it should be part of what the facilitator or chair does at the beginning. Okay, remember, this is our mandate, and this is the most important thing that we have to accomplish in this committee meeting. So make sure that you've got good agendas and that you've got a strategy on each agenda. What's the most important thing that we need to accomplish? And make sure that for the committee overall, you as the CEO or the executive director, make sure that that committee not only has a mandate or terms of reference, however you want to refer to it, but they also have specific achievable short-term objectives. So if the membership committee is responsible for increasing membership by 10% a year, what's the 3-month goal? What's the 6-month goal? What are the steps that we want to go through? So you want to make sure that every committee member is very clear on why they're there, for every meeting, what needs to be accomplished, and what their deadlines are. So in order to keep committees productive, make sure they know what they're doing and give them enough rope so that when they accomplish what they accomplished, they feel good about it. They don't feel, oh, well, I'm just basically the minion of the executive director and I just kind of, did this stuff. It's, hey, I feel proud because I actually accomplished this.
Exactly. People need to have skin in the game, right? I mean, otherwise, how would they know or find themselves productive?
Yeah, exactly. Kevin.
Thanks, Erin. So our next question is, so we're all familiar with the practice of adding times to meeting agendas to ensure that the meeting doesn't drag on too long on one or two specific items. But in addition to the agenda items and timing, what else should be on those meeting agendas?
Well, let's talk about timing first. If you just give people, 8 agenda items and we've got to get through it in an hour, it really doesn't help the facilitator to figure out how much time should be spent on each agenda item. So you want to make sure that for each agenda item, it says, this is going to be between 9 and 9:15. And the next agenda item is 9:15 to 9:20. Make sure that they know exactly what to do to keep it on time. So that's critical in terms of the agenda is, yes, you want to make sure there's timing on there. You want to make sure that the agenda items you've got there are reasonable for the amount of time that you've got for the meeting itself. So, don't set people up for failure by giving them agenda items that are going to take 50% longer than they're going to need, or that they get rushed into decisions that they really need to spend more time on. So in terms of what's on the agenda, Kevin, yes, we want to make sure that timing is on the agenda. We want to make sure that we've got a reasonable amount to accomplish, but not too much to accomplish during that period. We want to make sure that we've got something very well organized so people understand what their role is.
Thank you. So our next question is, what are some visual cues that you would recommend using in a boardroom setting in in-person meetings to sort of help keep the meeting on track?
Well, great point. Not everybody has all of their directors meet in the boardroom, but whether you're meeting in the boardroom or you are meeting virtually, I would definitely include a statement that the chair reads before the meeting starts. So something along the lines of, here's what we're expecting in terms of, behavior in the meeting. This is what we're looking for from you. If it's a committee meeting, a reminder that this is our mandate. If it's a board meeting, the most important thing that we have to get done today is this. So yeah, I think it's a great idea to have ideas and tips to keep people on track, whether it's sticky notes in a boardroom or it's a statement that the chair reads before the meeting starts. Do make sure that that statement that the chair is going to read is actually in the agenda, so it's actually written there and it's in front of everybody. Do we have any more questions, Kevin?
That was our last question, Erin. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks, Kevin. So that concludes our HPA podcast for today. We really thank you for being with us here today, and we would appreciate any feedback or comments about this podcast. We'd also like to know if there's a topic that is of interest to you that you want us to talk about in any of our future podcasts. Please let us know. More importantly, if you want help with meeting facilitation or meeting management, please do reach out to us. Erin, final words?
Yes, well, next month, we're going to be talking about preparing for uncertainty. Do you have a financial contingency plan? Join us on April 15th for our next podcast. And if you're not on our podcast invitation list, here's a QR code to subscribe. And also remember that all of our podcasts and webinars are on our YouTube channel where you can access them and watch them at your leisure.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Erin, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Kevin.